Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. It was a foggy night. I was driving along Interstate 40 doing my usual trucking job. I'd been on the road for hours, heading towards Amarillo, Texas. I can't say I hadn't done this road countless times before, but something felt different that night. The air was thick and heavy, and the distant sounds of nature seemed to be replaced by an eerie silence. As the night wore on, I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to a story I'd heard from a fellow trucker at the last stop. He told me about a haunted stretch of highway not too far from where I was. It was said to be cursed, and people often reported strange occurrences, like ghostly figures appearing on the side of the road, only to vanish when approached. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, but somehow the thought of it still managed to creep under my skin. I decided to take a break, hoping to take some steam off. I pulled into a small truck stop, nestled between the towering trees that lined the road. The place was deserted, with just a single flickering streetlight illuminating the parking lot. I parked my rig, turned off the engine, and leaned back in my seat, rubbing my tired eyes. As I sat there, trying to collect my thoughts, I noticed something odd in my rear view mirror. There was another truck parked a few spaces away from mine, with its lights off. I hadn't seen it when I pulled in, but it looked old and rusty, like it hadn't moved in years. The cab was dark, but I could see the faint outline of a man sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. My heart began to race as I tried to convince myself that it was just another trucker, taking a break like me. But there was something off about the way he was sitting there, motionless, in the darkness. I decided to get out of my truck to stretch my legs, hoping that maybe I could get a better look at the guy and put my mind at ease. As I stepped out, the cold air hit me like a ton of bricks. It was unnaturally chilly, and the fog seemed to be getting thicker by the minute. I walked around the front of my rig, trying not to make it obvious that I was checking out the other truck. My heart was starting to beat fast as I slowly approached the rusty old vehicle. I was just a few feet away when I noticed something that freaked me out. The truck's license plate was covered in what appeared to be dried blood, and the cab's windows were smeared with streaks of red. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of warm jelly. I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the grisly scene. That's when I heard a low, deep growl emanating from the cab of the truck, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. I felt my blood run cold, and I knew I had to get away from that truck as quickly as possible. As I backed away, I heard the creak of the rusty door as it began to open, but I refused to look back. I sprinted towards my rig, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. Once I was safely inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and tore out of that parking lot, leaving a trail of dust behind me. As I sped down the highway, it felt like I was being pursued by something. The fog had grown so thick that it was difficult to see more than a few feet in front of me, but I pressed on, desperate to put as much distance between me and that truck stop as possible. Every now and then, I could have sworn I saw the faint outline of that rusty truck in my rear view mirror, but it would always disappear when I tried to focus on it. My heart raced and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I couldn't tell if my mind was playing tricks on me or if the truck was really there, following me through the night. Hours passed, and the sun began to rise, casting an eerie glow through the fog that still clung to the road. I was exhausted and running low on fuel, but I was too terrified to stop. My whole body ached from the tension, and my head was pounding. But I knew that if I stopped, even for a moment, whatever that thing was might catch up to me. As the day wore on, the fog finally began to dissipate, and I could see the road more clearly. I still felt like someone was following me, but there was no sign of the rusty truck in my rear view mirror anymore. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination brought on by fatigue, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Eventually, I made it to Amarillo, exhausted and on edge. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and parked my rig. I needed to rest, but the thought of closing my eyes and leaving myself vulnerable to whatever was out there terrified me. I decided to call my boss and explain the situation, hoping that maybe he could offer some advice or reassurance. I told him everything that had happened, from the strange truck at the truck stop to the feeling of being pursued. He listened patiently, never interrupting or questioning the validity of my story. When I was finished, he was silent for a moment before speaking in a low, serious tone. He told me that he heard similar stories from other truckers over the years, and that there was an unspoken rule among them to never stop at that particular truck stop on Interstate 40. It was said to be cursed, and those who stopped there would be haunted by an evil presence that would follow them for the rest of their lives. He advised me to take some time off and get some rest, promising that he'd find someone to cover my road in the meantime. I took his advice. I've never been back to that stretch of Interstate 40 since. It's been years, but I can still feel the presence of whatever it was that stalked me that night, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I know I'll never be able to escape it completely, but I've learned to live with the fear and to always trust my instincts on the road. That haunted truck stop and the rusty old truck continue to haunt my dreams, serving as a constant reminder that there are things out there that we can't explain. Things that are better left alone. I've been driving trucks for the better part of a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange and unusual things on the road. Most of the time, I can laugh them off or chalk them up to fatigue or an overactive imagination. But there's one experience that still haunts me to this day, one that I can't explain or rationalize. It was a typical night on the road, cruising along Interstate 70, heading towards Denver. I'd been on this route countless times before, and I knew it like the back of my hand. The darkness of the night was broken only by the glow of my dashboard and the occasional passing vehicle. The hum of the engine and the sound of the tires on the pavement were almost hypnotic, lulling me into a sense of complacency. That's when it happened. I was listening to my favorite late-night talk radio show, the host discussing some paranormal phenomenon or another, when the signal started to fade in and out. I figured it was just the usual interference from the mountains or a passing truck, but then the voice on the radio changed. It wasn't the familiar, smooth tones of the radio host anymore, but a raspy, distorted voice that sent chills down my spine. The voice began making threats, saying things that made my blood run cold. It talked about knowing where I was, how it would find me, and what it would do to me when it did. It spoke in graphic detail, painting a horrifying picture that left me feeling sick to my stomach. I tried to change the station, but the voice seemed to follow me no matter what frequency I tuned to. I knew it was probably just some sick prankster messing with the radio signal, but there was something in the voice that felt so real, so menacing, that it was impossible to forget the fear that had taken hold of me. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white as I tried to focus on the road ahead. My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation for what was happening. Maybe it was some sort of targeted broadcast. Someone had somehow figured out how to intercept my radio and send a signal directly to my truck. Or perhaps it was some kind of elaborate hoax, a stunt by the radio station to drum up ratings. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I had a feeling that someone was out there waiting for me. As the night continued, the threats became more frequent and more disturbing. The voice seemed to take pleasure in tormenting me, describing in vivid detail the things it would do to me and the people I cared about. I could feel my sanity starting to slip away and my fear giving way to a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't escape. Eventually, I couldn't take any more. I pulled off the highway at the next exit and found a truck stop, hoping that maybe the voice would stop if I left the road. I parked my rig, turned off the engine, and sat there in the darkness, praying that the nightmare would end. For a while, it seemed like it had worked. The voice was gone, and the familiar sounds of the radio host filled the cab once again. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. But just as I was starting to feel like myself again, the voice returned, louder and more sinister than before. It taunted me, mocking my attempts to escape and promising that it would never leave me alone. It seemed to revel in my fear, feeding off my terror like some kind of twisted parasite. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I spent the rest of the night in the truck stop, too afraid to get back on the road, too terrified to sleep. I sat there in the darkness, my body tense and my eyes wide, listening to the voice as it continued to torment me. It felt like an eternity before the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the darkness, offering a small measure of relief. The day grew older, the voice began to fade, growing more distant and less frequent. I hoped that maybe it had finally decided to leave me alone, that the nightmare was finally over. But even as the voice receded, it felt like I was being stalked, that I was never truly alone. I eventually mustered up the courage to get back on the road, but the experience left me shaken and paranoid. I was constantly checking my mirrors, searching for any sign of the mysterious figure that had been threatening me. I kept the radio off, too afraid to hear that voice again, even though I knew it was probably just a prank. I made it to Denver without any further incidents, but the memory of that night still haunts me. I've tried to put it behind me, to convince myself that it was just some sick joke, but there's a part of me that can't let go of the fear. I still find myself glancing in the rear view mirror, searching for any sign of danger, and I can't listen to the radio without feeling how I felt that night. I've talked to other truckers about my experience, and while most of them laugh it off as a tall tale or a case of an overactive imagination, a few have shared similar stories. They speak of mysterious voices on the radio of threats and taunts that seem to come from nowhere and follow them for miles. They talk about the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by some unseen force that seems to take pleasure in their terror. I don't know if there's any truth to these stories, or if they're just the product of too many late nights and too much caffeine. But one thing I know for sure is that I'll never forget that night on Interstate 70, the night that a voice on the radio turned our world upside down and left me with a fear that I can't escape. I still don't know who or what was behind that terrifying voice on the radio, and I don't think I ever will. But it's a constant reminder that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes those things find their way into our lives, leaving us with scars that never fully heal. I've been a trucking for a while, paid the bills, and gave me a reason to be anywhere but in my house. Some days are fun and others just tedious. However, there's one experience that stands out above the rest, a night that has left me questioning my own sanity and wondering if there are things out there that we just can't understand. It was a quiet evening, and I was hauling a load of construction materials across a rural stretch of highway. The route was familiar to me, and I knew I was in for a long and monotonous drive. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the road illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional passing vehicle. The hum of my engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the pavement were almost hypnotic, lulling me into a sense of complacency. As I drove, I listened to the radio station, enjoying the company of the DJ's voice and the classic rock tunes that filled the cab. The miles seemed to fly by, and I found myself growing more and more relaxed as the night wore on. That is until I noticed the other semi-truck ahead of me, its taillights glowing faintly in the distance. At first, there was nothing unusual about the truck. It was just another fellow traveler making their way through the night. But as I drew closer, something about the truck seemed off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. As I continued to follow the truck, I noticed that it seemed to be taking the same route as me, turning down the same side roads and maintaining a steady pace just ahead of me. I found this curious, but thought it was probably just a coincidence. We were likely both headed to the same destination or a nearby town. However, as we approached an old, dilapidated barn, the truck suddenly veered off the road, heading down a narrow, overgrown path that seemed to lead to nowhere. This abrupt turn caught me off guard, and I slowed my rig gearing down the path and trying to make out where it led. It seemed to be a dead end, with no signs of recent use or any indication that it was a viable route for a truck, and yet the other truck had disappeared down the path, seemingly vanishing into thin air. Something strange was happening, something beyond my understanding. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I pulled off the highway and cautiously followed the path, my headlights barely cutting through the darkness as I crept along. The path was narrow and bumpy, and it like I was heading into something I wouldn't be able to explain. As I rounded a bend, I saw the truck stop at the end of the path, seemingly trapped by the overgrowth and lack of any viable exit. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next, but before I could make a decision, the truck's lights flickered and went out, plunging the area into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, stepping out of my rig to investigate. The air was heavy with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I shone the flashlight at the truck, but it was gone. There was no sign of it, no tire tracks, no indication that it had ever been there. It was as if the truck had simply vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. Shaken and disoriented, I climbed back into my cab and turned my rig around, heading back to the highway as quickly as I could. The image of that truck, seemingly trapped and then disappearing without a trace, haunted me for the rest of my drive. I just witnessed something beyond the realm of reason, something that defied explanation. the memory of that truck, seemingly trapped and then disappearing without a trace, stayed with me, making it difficult to focus on the road ahead. In the days and weeks that followed, I replayed the events of that night over and over in my mind, searching for some logical explanation. I considered the possibility that it was a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, but the vividness of the memory and the sense of worry it left me with were too real to dismiss. I began to research similar stories, seeking out fellow truckers who might have had similar experiences. To my surprise, I found that I wasn't alone. Many truckers shared their own tales of ghost trucks and unexplained phenomena on the open road. Some had even experienced strange electrical disturbances or other inexplicable occurrences during their encounters. These stories only served to deepen the mystery and leave me with more questions than answers. I couldn't help but wonder if there were forces at work that we couldn't comprehend, or if there was something about the open road that attracted the inexplicable. As time passed, my obsession with that night began to fade, replaced by demands of my job and the day-to-day realities of life on the road. But the memory never truly left me, and I found myself keeping an eye out for that truck or any other signs of the strange and unexplained. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the experience has left an indelible mark on my soul. It's a constant reminder that there are things on the road that can't be explained, things that defy logic and reason. And sometimes those things find their way into our lives, leaving us with questions that may never be answered. That night on the road still lingers in my mind, serving as a reminder to always stay vigilant and trust my instincts when I'm out there on the open road. Because you never know what you might encounter or what dangers might be lurking just beyond the reach of your headlights. I may never know the truth behind the ghost truck that disappeared down that dead-end path, but the experience has taught me to respect the mysteries of the open road and to always be prepared for the unexpected.
Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.